Srimad Bhagavad Gita, Chapter 2, Part 2. In the next verse, Sanjaya describes what happened when Arjuna flatly refused to fight. Tamuvacha Hrishikeshaha Prahasanniva Bharata Senayorubayor Madhye Vishidantam Idham Vachaha. O Bharata, Dhritarashtra, Sri Krishna, the Lord of Senses, as if smiling, addressed the following words to desponding Arjuna in the midst of two armies. Arjuna, filled with valor and enthusiasm, has entreated Lord Krishna to place his chariot between the two armies so that he could behold the warriors. It was befitting for Arjuna to get ready for fighting, which was his aim. But there, instead of waging the war, he felt grieved. So, Sri Krishna Paramatma started the gospel of the Gita. Prahasanniva, meaning smiling as it were, means that when Sri Krishna Paramatma perceived that Arjuna's enthusiasm for the war had changed into grief, he smiled. Secondly, in the 7th verse, he said, "Do instruct me, who have taken refuge in you." But in the 9th verse, he says, "I will not fight." So, Sri Krishna Paramatma smiled because the devotee who takes refuge in his preceptor just becomes an instrument in the hands of his preceptor, and the preceptor is fully responsible for the duty of the disciple. The disciple has no option but to obey his preceptor and do as his teacher wishes. Arjuna's declaration not to fight is practically a withdrawal as from his refuge in the Lord. Eva means that Lord Krishna must have burst into laughter after hearing Arjuna's decision of not fighting, but he spoke smiling. When Arjuna said, "I will not fight," Sri Krishna Paramatma should have told him to do as he wished, but he thought that Arjuna was unable to take the right decision because he was overwhelmed with grief and worry. So there was an overflow of Sri Krishna Paramatma's love for him. God, instead of paying attention to the words of his devotees, judges them by their feelings. So Sri Krishna Paramatma, instead of paying attention to Arjuna's words, "I will not fight," started the gospel from the next verse. Moreover, he accepts those devotees who take refuge in him even by words as his own because of his boundless grace. Hrishikesha means that the Lord is the indweller. Via he knows the feelings of beings, Sri Krishna Paramatma knows that Arjuna is turning away from the war because he is overpowered by the urge of infatuation for his kinsmen, and he does not see his grief melting away by merely acquiring kingdom. So he is saying, "I will not fight." But he also knows that as soon as his delusion is destroyed, he will act upon his instruction. In idam vacha, uvacha, the use of word uvacha, that is spoke, was sufficient. There was no need to use the word vacha because vacha is also included in uvacha. It seems repetition, but actually it is not so. The word vacha has been used to point out the secret wisdom contained in the next verse uttered by Sri Krishna Paramatma in simple and easily understandable language. Sri Krishna Paramatma preaches the gospel of freedom from grief to the grieved Arjuna and says as follows. Shri Bhagavanuvāca Ashocyananvashocastvam Prajñāvādāmscha bhāshase Gatāsūna Gatāshumscha Nanushocanti Panditaha. The blessed Lord said, "Arjuna, you grieve for those who should not be grieved for, yet speak words of wisdom. The wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead. A man is grieved when he classifies objects and persons into two divisions, one's own and not one's own, such as our kinsman and not our kinsman, of our caste and not of our caste, of our stage of life and not of our stage of life, our followers and not our followers. We have the sense of mine, attachment, love, and desire for those whom we regard as ours. Through these, the sense of mine and desire, etc., evils such as grief, worry, fear, perturbation, commotion, and strain, etc., spring up. The root of all evils is the sense of mine and desire, and so on. This is the rule. In the beginning of the Gita, Dhritarashtra said, "What did my sons and the sons of Pandu do?" It shows his partiality towards his own sons and attachment for them, though the Pandavas regarded him more than their father. Arjuna also developed the same attachment, but he had no partiality. He was impartial, and so he uses the terms seeing all these relations and how can we, killing our own kinsmen, be happy. It means that Arjuna had attachment for the Kuru family, and because of the possibility of the destruction of the family, he was grieved. To remove this grief, Sri Krishna Paramatma preaches the gospel of the Gita, which begins with this 11th verse. At last, Sri Krishna Paramatma will declare that there is no justification for him to grieve, and he should take refuge in him alone and should not grieve. Grieve not. Ma Shuchaha. The reason is that the dependence on the world leads to grief, while supreme or exclusive devotion to the Lord leads to the state which is free from vices such as grief and worry and so on. There are two things in the world, the real and the unreal, the soul and the body. Both of them are not to be grieved. The real is imperishable and therefore should not be grieved for, and the unreal is bound to perish as it is perishing every moment, so it should not be grieved for. It means that they are grieved for only because of ignorance or lack of discrimination. Whatever circumstances in the form of birth, death, profit, loss, and so on a man finds himself in is the result of his way. The fate works his previous actions. It is sheer ignorance to feel happy or sad in those favorable or unfavorable circumstances, because they are transient. On the one hand, you are speaking words of wisdom, but on the other hand, you are grieving. It shows that you are merely talking tall. Actually, you are not wise, because the wise don't grieve for anyone. You also say that with the destruction of a family, its age-old traditions disappear. Women become corrupt and there ensues an intermixture of caste which leads to hell, and being deprived of the offerings of rice ball and water, their manes also fall. These words, like the wise, also prove that the body is perishable while the soul is imperishable. Had the soul not been imperishable, how could you have feared the fall of slayers and members of the family? Further, you could have not worried about the fall of manes. Your worry and fear prove that the body is perishable while its master, the soul, is eternal. So, you should not grieve for them. It is out of ignorance that you grieve for the bodies, because they will all perish. You should not grieve for them. Such grief is a blunder. It is also a mistake to grieve for those who are dead, because they have to suffer torture. If people here grieve for them, the departing soul has to drink and eat the tears and phlegm shed by the people here. Similarly, we should not grieve or worry for those who are living, because grief, that is worry, does not help them in any way. We should rather rear and help them. Arjuna's limbs are giving away and his mouth is getting parched. The root of such feelings is his identity with the body. Such identity with the body creates affinity and those who nurse this body. That affinity gives birth to grief and worry by thinking of their death. So he is grieved and sad after thinking of those who are living as well as those who are dead. He is grieved about the dead because, deprived of the offerings of rice ball and water, the men have a downfall. And he is worried about the living ones because they are arrayed on the battlefields, taking their lives and property. Both types of worries are pertaining to bodies, so they are of the same character. Instead of grieving for those who are dead, we should offer water and rice ball, etc., because it is our duty. Similarly, we should make arrangement to rear up those who are living. So, we should give a serious thought, as thought enables us to understand our duty, while worry destroys the power of thinking. Discrimination between the real and the unreal is called panda, that is wisdom, and one who has developed discrimination is known as pandita. Such wise men don't grieve because they can discriminate between the real and the unreal, the imperishable self, that is soul, and the perishable body. Grief ensues only when the unreal is accepted as real. That is, there is a desire to maintain the body forever. For the real, there is no grief or worry at all. In the next two verses, the Lord explains why it is unwise to grieve for what is imperishable. Natvevaham jatu nasam, natvam neme janadipaha, nachaiva na bhavishyamaha, sarve vayamata param. In fact, there was never a time when I or you or these kings were non-existent, nor is it a fact that we shall cease to be in a future. There are two things in the world, the soul, the real, and the body, which is unreal, and both of them are not to be grieved for, because the soul never ceases to be and the body is perishable. So here is the description that the soul is immortal while the body is mortal. The people think that I did not exist before my incarnation, and you and these kings were also non-existent before birth. But it is not so. All of us certainly existed because the real is always existent, having no effect of time, place, and circumstances. I, you, and these kings had their pre-existence. This declaration could suffice. But contrary to this, it is said, I, you, and these kings had no such pre-existence. This is not true. The reason is that by the latter expression that there was no such pre-existence is not true. The fact of the pre-existence is emphasized. It means that the real is eternal. It was never a not. By the term Jatu, the Lord means to say that in all times, past, present, and future, and in all climes, circumstances, states, incidents, and things, this real never causes to be in the least. Here, by giving the word Aham, Sri Krishna Paramatma identifies himself with other people in order to explain that the real never ceases to be. While in the 5th verse of the 4th chapter, Sri Krishna Paramatma says, You and I have taken many births. I know them all, while you don't know, which shows that he, as the Lord, is different from men. In the 5th verse of the 4th chapter, the Lord expresses his excellence, eminence, and glory as compared to ordinary mortals, while in this verse he expresses his unity with the soul of common men. In future, the bodies will not continue to be the same, and one day they will perish. But we, souls, will never cease to be because the real is eternal. It was neither non-existent in the past nor will be in the future. Sri Krishna Paramatma has talked about the past and the future by saying that there was never a time when they were non-existent, nor they will cease to be. But he has not talked about the present because they are clearly seen at present through bodies. In their present existence, there is not race of doubt. But if we think seriously, we come to know that we, that is soul, exist at present, but the bodies are kaleidoscopic. Therefore, we should realize that we are different from the bodies, because we have our existence at present as we had in the past and we will have in future, while bodies are perishable. A man experiences his existence before sleep and after sleep, but he has his existence during sleep also, while his body is changing every moment, and it will perish one day. Similarly, the bodies of all of us, I, you, and these kings did not exist in the past, nor will exist in future, and at present also perishing every moment. But we, our own self, existed in the past, will exist in the future, and also exist now. Our existence is beyond time because we are the knower of all times, present, past, and future. The Lord has spoken this verse in order to explain this transcendental entity. An exceptional fact. Sri Krishna Paramatma in this verse wants to say that the bodies are perishable while the self is imperishable, and it is a rule that what exists in the beginning and the end also exists in the middle, and what does not exist in the beginning and the end does not exist in the middle either. But the question arises that now in the middle these bodies are visible. The answer is that the senses, mind, and intellect with which we see and the worldly objects which are seen both are perishable and change every moment. The man, that is self, identifies himself with the seen. Then he is called the seer. When the instruments of perception and the objects of perception are all perishable and transient, then how can the apparent onlooker be permanent? The apparent entity of the seer, that is onlooker, is there because of the affinity between the seer, the senses, and the seen. In case there is no such affinity, then this apparent entity of the seer is melted away. But the base of the apparent entity, which is truth, persists. That truth is called the base of creation, preservation, and destruction, and illuminator of all seeming entities. These names, base and illuminator, are only in relation to the objects which they base and illumine. In absence of those objects, the truth ever remains as it is. He who has an eye on that truth can never grieve. This way, I, you, and these kings are not to be grieved at all.